Hello, free speech and the challenge of social media students. Dr. Conway back to you for lesson 9, which is titled The Science on the Social Psychology of Social Media Behavior. This builds directly on our last lesson, which was on misinformation and disinformation, which fits in, as you recall, to the broader narrative of our course that we have free speech and we may value free speech, but is free speech what we're actually getting in the social media environment? This is where our course begins to shift to this question. I've seen lots of people, most people support free speech with certain limitations, some more openly than others. But now we have to begin to ask ourselves more and more after the last lesson and into this lesson, whether we in fact are getting our understanding of free speech in the social media context. So let's look at this now, this time from the perspective of the social psychology of it. But previously we talked about it from the context of how social media engineering creates silos or bubbles of communities, and we're seeing that a lot right now in the U.S. election, for example, where one half of the country is basically in a completely different information filter from another part of the country. And these are the types of things that go on, primarily because social media infrastructure was built for viral marketing, which means that, it reinforces the things that you have already looked at or that you have already demonstrated through algorithms and cookies of what it is you prioritize. And because social media is so broad, there needs to be those mechanisms to filter information, to direct it, to control the type of information you see that's most relevant to you as indicated from your previous engagement with social media. But does that enable free speech, or does that distort free speech? Right? And then when you layer on top of that the question of misinformation and disinformation that can occupy those silos, or those bubbles of information, we begin to even see another layer where, yes, we all value free speech, but is that really what we're getting on social media? That's a legitimate question. And I think it's more than just a legitimate question. It can be factually demonstrated that we are getting distortions in the what I would call the radio waves of information that you get on social media are being distorted through a filter of social media engineering, through a filter of a tendency for the social media to be used for misinformation and disinformation in a lot of cases. And now, how does that get reinforced by the social psychological aspects of social media? And so let's look at that today, okay? So let's talk about this, okay? In our last lesson, right, we explored the harms that can be created by misinformation and disinformation on social media platforms. And building on that lesson, we are asking 3 supplemental questions here. Why do people give prominence to misinformation and disinformation on social media platforms? It's hard to deny that misinformation and disinformation isn't given prominence because we're seeing it grow at exponential rates in social media, particularly conspiracy theories, from QAnon to any other different groups or with different motivations, right? Second, how do social media users participate in the circulation of misinformation and disinformation on social media? Why are people doing it? What's motivating them to do it, right? Is there any hope for facts, truth, and expertise in the social media world? And can it help counter misinformation and disinformation in the context of the social psychology of research in this area? All right, so those 3 questions are kind of what we're dealing with today. All right, let's deal with the first one. Right, scientific studies have consistently shown that social media that encourages emotional reactions drives website visits and recirculation of misinformation and disinformation. The psychological studies in this area are beginning to mount, and we're beginning to understand what's going on, and how yes, we value free speech, but how emotional manipulation can mean that, and compounded with the engineering infrastructure of social media, right, can impact whether we're really getting free speech or whether we're getting distorted speech in the aggregate, right? It's not that there's no clear, truthful, free speech in social media, but in the aggregate, are we seeing a greater trend? And I think it's indisputable, all right? And the emotions that tend to drive the spread of misinformation and disinformation now are quite heavily studied in experimentation. And these emotions serve as motivators for misinformation and tools for disinformation. All right, and primarily it relates to the issue that any law enforcement official would tell you, right? That emotion is behind many crimes, including violent crimes, albeit we're not talking about that here, because emotions tend to suspend reason, right? Most violent crimes that are not premeditated crimes are driven by outbursts of emotion, right? And the suspension of reason. I think we can all agree with that, right? When any of us has done something really stupid in our lives, and we all have at one point or another, we regret it later, and when we look back, it's because we lost our temper, or we became envious, or we had one or another of or be anxious or fearful, one or another of a negative emotion, right? And the same is true in social media environment, where crimes may not be physically violent, but they can be quite harmful if we're passing a lot of what goes off on social media as free speech, all right? And recent experimental studies have indicated two negative emotions in particular are culprits: anger and anxiety, all right? Anger encourages what is known as motivated reasoning, right? I don't like you, so anything anybody says about you, I'm going to believe it, and I'm going to try to use it against you, right? And that's called it's also called preconception bias, right? And we've all experienced that in our lives. We don't like somebody, so if somebody gossips about them, we're more inclined to believe it than if they were our friend, right? If they were our friend, we would sort of reason would take over and say, look, I know Jane or I know John, and he's not like that. I mean, that's I don't believe that. That's wrong. I'm going to investigate. I'm going to ask. I'm going to find out. But if you already have a bias towards that person, all that does is reinforce, right, your bias, and that's called motivated reasoning, right? You're motivated to believe it, regardless of whether it's truthful or not, right? And for this reason, politicians will manipulate that, guarding against the loss of their support base. They attempt to manufacture anger against the opposition, right? Because then it creates motivated reasoning, right? It creates preconception bias. So they don't have to work as hard anymore to retain your support, right? Because they've replaced that reason with anger, okay? They usually cherry pick facts, exaggerate facts, or fabricate untruths to create and manufacture that anger, so that motivated reasoning reduces their transaction costs in keeping you in the fold, right? So that's a key thing. That's a key tactic of all forms of manipulation, not just politicians, right? Anxiety, on the other hand, tends to attract social media users to information sources and social media environments that confirm feelings of anxiety. I feel anxious. I'm going to investigate more about that anxiousness. And then the more I investigate about that anxiousness, I find other people who are anxious about it. And then we compound ourselves. And this is called confirmation bias. All right? So I'm fearful. I'm going to find other people who are fearful. I'm going to talk to them about it because I don't want to feel alone. I don't want to feel like the only person that feels anxious about this. And as soon as I engage in that exercise, I'm drawn more and more and more into the same anxiety and the same confirmation bias that was my original source of search, our rationale for search. Okay? Anxiety is one of the central emotions that feeds problem of recirculation of conspiracy theories. Whether it be QAnon, whether, whatever, what we just saw in the United States with President Trump arguing that there was corruption in the vote, right? People were anxious about that. He was playing on that anxiety to reinforce a confirmation bias, okay? Because that makes people less questioning of information, right? That does not violate their preconceptions or preoccupations. And so, and this is what anybody who's trying to sell a story that isn't factually supported tries to create anxiety, because it creates a scenario where emotion overtakes reason, or emotion overtakes facts and evidence. All right? And this is a common tactic. It's a real tactic. President Trump knew exactly what he was doing when he kept reinforcing this idea, right? He knew exactly the dynamic he was creating in a social media environment. This is not by accident. He's not insane the way other people like to, some people in the United States media like to characterize him. He's not off his rocker. He's not a psychopath or a sociopath or a narcissist in the classic sense. He might have elements of those, and he probably does, but primarily he's tactical, right? These are tactics, okay, that are used, okay? And disinformation exploits these emotions, right? And misinformation can perpetuate them, right? And without devious intent, but nevertheless, it can happen. So, and anger and anxiety are not the only two emotions that create these dynamics. There are others like shock and repulsion and so on, but the studies are beginning to show that the two major ones are anger and anxiety. All right, and this is because it's human survival genetics that anger, fear, anxiety are things that in the wild, right, in thousands of years ago when we were just a surviving species, these are things that kept us alive in the wild, right? This, our genetic programming, was that you don't walk too far away from the village, and when there's wild animals out there or other tribes or whatever, you did have fear and anxiety, right? And you did have anger against these other groups because they would try to steal your food, or they would try to kill you or whatever. And this is the way humans were able to survive. And so genetically we're programmed to reach for those emotions much more easily in our brain chemistry, right? And it's much more, they tend to be more immediate in terms of the stimulus they give the brain, right? Compared to positive emotions such as joy, which takes time to build up, interest, which takes time to build up, contentment, which takes calmness and time to build up, love, right? All of these things, right, tend to be, the emotions that make us feel good, but they also tend to be the emotions that take effort, take engagement, take relationship, rather than the immediate reaction, the survival instincts of anger, anxiety, shock, repulsion. So these are genetically ingrained tendencies for us to lean to these emotions more quickly, because they give us immediate gratification, they give us immediate awareness, they give us immediate reaction. Okay? And, psychologists will readily point out that the reason for this is that negative events have a greater immediate impact on the brain and the brain chemistry than positive ones, okay? Positive ones may have more lasting impacts, but we're talking about immediacy, immediate gratification. I'll get that person if I say this information, or I'm going to watch out for that because I'm afraid, right? And these kinds of things are very typical, right? And this is referred to as negativity bias, and its very powerful effects on decisions, behavior, and relationships, especially in a social media environment where everything is so quick, right? Everything is immediate. Immediate gratification, immediate click of the mouse, immediate click of the keyboard, everything is immediate. Very ideally suited to these kinds of negative emotions and negativity bias. So that's where the engineering of the thing, of social media, impacts with these social psychological dynamics to create what we would call this toxic soup. All right? And it's also the fact that social media interface eliminates the substantial role of physical and tonal communication, right? So I can say things in social media, and I'm reading it, right? So unless you're seeing me on video, you're not getting my tonal inflection. Oh, you're so silly. If I say it like that, oh, that guy's so silly, man. He's totally different, right? And so social media also tends to eliminate inflection, right? And eliminate physical expression, right? So that So that that sort of vacuum is ideal for negative emotions as well, because what do positive emotions tend to require, right? A lot more of tonal inflection of your voice, a lot more physical expression. You haven't seen a friend for a long time, you hug them, right? You do all the positive emotions tend to be richer in terms of not only their verbal expression, but also their tonal expression, their physical dynamic, right? And so social media tends to be a more amenable environment to these kinds of negative emotions as opposed to these positive emotions. All right. So this leaves ample room for the adoption of negative interpretations of what's said on social media. It's easy to think the worst, right? Somebody could write a sentence and a very optimistic person will read it and say, "Oh, that person's pretty negative. But, maybe they're not that bad." But a lot of people would look at that and kind of go, "Wow, that person's like, wow, man, are they ever bad? Like, are they ever saying that bad stuff? And this is the irony of social media. Okay, it tends to be conducive to these negative emotions more than the positive emotions. In addition to the psychological factors I've already mentioned to you. And so let's look now at how misinformation and disinformation travels on social media. Okay, recent studies have noted that untrue information travels faster on social media than truthful information. That's now been heavily studied, with large studies on Twitter, large studies on Facebook by Harvard, by the Pew Center, by very credible, objective, scientific organizations. And there's no question that the data shows that untrue information tends to travel faster on social media than truthful information. So again, we've got on top of the psychological factors, we've got this dynamic as well, right? There are at least 4 causes for this, all right? Firstly, recent experimental studies have found that acceptance of untruth information is enhanced when it is oft repeated. And social media is classic, right? For repeat, because it doesn't cost anything to repeat it, to continue to pound away at it, usually through bots. It's even automated. You don't even have to do it physically, right? And you'll notice that during this election, even though it was clear that President-elect Biden was going to win, what did President Trump do? He just oft repeated the issue of ostensive fraud, despite the fact there was no substantive evidence for that, right? Again, a tactic, not by accident, okay? And memory, and this is because, oft repetition is very powerful, because memory plays a big role in the acceptance of information as probable or common knowledge. And memory enhances through repetition, an ideal condition for social media, and an ideal tactic for disinformation, all right? The logic of this can be seen in many aspects of life where repetition creates mental retention. Studying for an exam. Habitual practice. Humans are routine animals. And acceptive of the way things are. No, this is just the way things are. Right? How many things in life do we kind of say, this is the way things are, without actually looking at them critically? Trust me. Be honest. Look. A lot. All right? So, and this is one of the things that psychologists are identifying. And humans by instinct, and that's another survival instinct. I already talked to you about some survival instincts, but genetic survival instincts also tend to be that, right? I haven't died doing this before. It's always brought food back to me before. It's always the way, so we prefer that familiarity, right? And are generally skeptical of change. People generally don't change if things are, kind of going okay. Right? Because of the fear of the unknown, the loss of control, 2 genetically programmed survival instincts, right? That are, they're hardwired, okay? And social media interacts with this hardwire, all right? So we have to be aware of that. Can't be naive about it, okay? Despite we might, really support free speech, as we all, and I think you realize we all should, but is that what we're getting in the social media context, right? When these things can be manipulated in the context of social media engineering. Secondly, researchers found that dramatic headlines constitute a sizable portion of social media interaction. Those are clickbait headlines, as we've talked about before. They're ideally suited for multiple exposures, because they are easily and quickly designed to trigger the emotions previously discussed, anger and anxiety. How many newspaper articles have you read recently where the title says, blah, 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 yelling, trying to evoke emotion. Then you get into the article and you say, well, I guess sorta. Yeah, I guess. But I don't see a lot there that would support that kind of a dramatic heading. That happens perhaps even a majority of the time now, even in traditional print media. Okay, particularly opinion print media from traditional sources, right? To drive traffic, right? Emotion drives traffic. Anger, anxiety drives traffic. And that's what they're trying to do, drive traffic. All right? Rise above the noise in social media. They're typically read at a much higher rate too. Studies will show that most things that are circulated in social media that are misinformation or disinformation are done after reading only the heading. Okay? Those studies have been comprehensively done as well. They feed almost instant gratification regarding doing something negative with negative emotions, right? Negative emotions first. They drive, right? Are quickly recirculated through social media infrastructure, because social media infrastructure is precisely designed to do that. That's why your phrases in Twitter can only be so long, right? Because you're primarily driving the clickbait, okay? You're primarily driving the extreme comment. All right? And let's not be naive about this, right? If you look at Twitter, most of it will be, even if a Twitter comment is talking about a long piece of work, the piece of work that will be extracted from, the elements that will be extracted from that piece of work to be placed in Twitter will be the extreme elements of that piece of work. All right? And interesting, some experimental studies have also shown that the problem of misinformation and disinformation in clickbait headings persists even when the text of an article is read and reveals that the headline is grossly exaggerated or blatantly untrue. It's because nobody wants to surrender their easy negative emotions of anger or anxiety, right? It's if you meet an anxious person and a person that suffers from anxiety, one of the first things that they'll tell you is that they know they suffer from anxiety. They know they're being unusually angry about something, but nevertheless they can't seem to stop themselves, right? They can't seem to overcome it, right? And it's because once the brain chemistry gets used to that kind of way of thinking, it's very difficult to unearth it. It's because it creates emotions in the system, right? Right? So endorphins and so on are created, and these things are reinforced. And so these are the types of things that social media, players in social media who want to promote misinformation and disinformation know these studies and know this stuff very, very well. All right? And that's how it gets played up. But then when it gets played up and it's reinforced by social media infrastructure, right? Algorithms and cookies and so on. I pose the question to you again. Is that really what we're getting on social media? It's 100% free speech. We're getting some, no question. Free speech is enabled in other areas, no question. But there's a preponderance of this other activity going on, and we would be naive not to realize that. Thirdly, the novelty of information plays a big role in the circulation of misinformation and disinformation, right? People are typically more interested in novel things, right? If you say, a person was riding a bike up the street, yeah, so. Person was riding a unicycle up the street through traffic at high speed. Whoa, that guy must be really good. I'd like to see that. How did he do that? Right? Novelty, right? Novelty, human nature, right? Anything shocking or new or unbelievable or anything that is shocking, new, and unbelievable are shocking and new, and it reinforces our biases, or justifies our anger or anxiety for us. That's even more powerful, right? And that's way more powerful than actually having to do the factual research, the tedious factual information to determine whether it's in fact true or not. Correct? So it's a natural bias, a natural tendency to want to move in that direction. Some of the largest studies of social media traffic have concluded that people are more likely to open up to misinformation and disinformation than truthful information, in substantial part because of the novelty factor. Okay? This is a really important point, because misinformation and disinformation is designed specifically to be novel. Right? That's the whole point of misinformation and disinformation, is it disconnects from facts so it can be novel, so it can drive attention, right? That's the whole point, okay? In this way, disinformation purveyors rise above the noise of terabytes of information shared on social media platforms every minute of every day. You rise to the top. That's the game. That's the way the game's played, right? And get inside that person's bubble and be profiled there. That's the game of the viral marketing infrastructure. Finally, social media platforms encourage popularity indicators such as likes and thumbs up indicators, right? It's a very common thing, trying to play on your emotions, right? These mechanisms serve the natural human tendency, again, genetically hardwired as communal animals, to be sensitive to external validation, a genetically programmed tribal instinct. Research suggests that more likes or thumbs up indicators translate for many people into perceptions that information or a comment on information is useful, has substance, is more likely to be correct. But that couldn't be further from the truth, right? On the other side of the coin, less likes or more thumbs down is seeing you bad, you're suppressing you must be wrong, rethink, go away, don't bother us, right? One of the most important lessons, however, that can be taught to a young person about social media is that information posted to social media, unless it is from a credible organization with its own vetting process, is not rated in any kind of objective or scientifically validated manner. All those likes, they're not substantial, they're not substantiated, but rather they are ratings reflecting the emotional biases, the confirmation biases, the motivated reasonings of the people clicking the like or the dislike, right? Right? But those tools can be very powerful if you're a person and you're not used to this, or you're not educated in social media the way you are being. You can be upset by all of those things, and that's a good way of repressing people, right? In fact, repressing free speech. All right, which again, I come back. We all value free speech, no question, for very good reasons. But is that what we're getting a lot of the times in social media? This is still a legitimate question we have outstanding, and we'll continue to talk about as we go through our course. Okay, and you will recall from previous lessons the following tactics of disinformation: sophisticated understanding of search engine optimization and big data analytics to target receptive or vulnerable audiences; extensive use of troll armies as a tool to suppress opposition, to create alternative and often confusing data; many dislikes if you're trying to speak from reason, many likes if you're reinforcing anxiety or the message that they would like to become a multiplier, an amplifier for, right? Automated technology, bots, plays a big role interacting with the social psychology of social media. That's the whole intent, right? Oft repetition, fake likes, fake dislikes, all of these kinds of things, bot driven in a lot of cases. Like sometimes you'll say something you have factual evidence in the newspaper, and you'll comment on it. You'll come back later, there's 30 dislikes, right? And most of those will be bot generated, or they'll be produced by troll armies. Okay, they'll have no substantive content to them. They're primarily designed to have social psychological effects. Okay. But how can we reverse this, right? The effects of factual rebuttals to misinformation and disinformation. It's problematic. Given all we have learned about how misinformation and disinformation exploits and ultimately compromises free speech in a democracy, the question becomes, is there any hope for counteracting this blight, right? We should have to ask ourselves. We value free speech, but you can't deny the role that social media can have in warping it, distorting it, given to the infrastructure and the behavior of misinformation and disinformation and its social psychological effects. That doesn't mean there aren't good purposes served by free speech and social media, right? We see that in advancing Indigenous people's goals, and Black Lives Matter, and in the Arab Spring and all that. But in terms of, with the exception of these special examples, the general day-to-day mass of people that are out there are being exposed to something that may be quite different than our notions of free speech that we carry around in our heads, right? There are important social psychological aspects to this discussion we'll address in the next lesson as well. But first, recent experimental studies indicate that people who generate arguments in support of misinformation or disinformation, as opposed to only passively receiving it, are much more difficult to convince in the face of overwhelming factual information proving the original information was false. In other words, the propagators of misinformation and disinformation are not easily swayed because they have a different agenda than buying into the facts. Their agenda is to create a play on your emotions, right? So turning them around is not easy in a social media environment. Factual information that debunks misinformation and disinformation is more effective when people were skeptical about the original information to begin with. In other words, these are people that are still relatively open-minded, as opposed to being within a specific bubble and being so overwrought with anger and anxiety or some other negative emotion that they got flaps over their ears, right? They're not prepared to listen. And this is the challenge that President-elect Biden will have in the United States, right? Just getting people to open up their ears is going to be 90% of the initial challenge, right? The initial reaction will be to try to for the other forces that would have otherwise maybe have supported President Trump will be to create more anger and anxiety to match any efforts that the new president-elect tries to bring in to open up the flaps on people's ears, right? There will be a tendency for anger, anxiety, misinformation, and disinformation to try to keep those flaps closed, okay? Third, debunking of misinformation and disinformation is more effective when it provides detailed factual rebuttal rather than simply labeling the information as incorrect. So when we hear Twitter's, putting a label on it, there's no evidence of this, or Facebook doing that, that's protecting them in terms of liability. Let's not kid ourselves. They're not going out of their ways to actually debunk these things. What they are is simply protecting their own platforms against criticism and attack from people in the legal establishment and so on, or in Congress or whatever, who may break them up or do something else to them. This is a self-protection mechanism rather than actually debunking disinformation and misinformation in social media. Okay, and the studies are playing on that, right? Debunking misinformation and disinformation is more effective when it provides detailed factual rebuttal. Facebook doesn't do that. Twitter doesn't do that, right? Google doesn't do that. Fourth, on an internet-wide scale, factual debunking appears so far to not be impacting the overall persistence of information and disinformation on social media. And that's because primarily of social media engineering, right? Once the bubble's created, it's very, very difficult to pry it open, to inject factual information to counteract misinformation and disinformation. Not impossible, but it's very difficult. And the studies are showing that, right? And this is what's fearful about it, right? This is why we ask the question. Yes, we support free speech, but is that really what we're getting? Or what percentage of that are we really getting in a social media context? Legitimate question. Fifth, debunking seems to work best when social media users are encouraged to engage actively in the debunking rather than being passive receptors of the information, right? And this point is a counter tactic against the efforts of misinformation and disinformation campaigns to recruit amplifiers and multipliers. So it's essentially recruiting amplifiers and multipliers in a different direction to counter false information. And you saw that also in the recent election in the United States, where the media was taking extra pains to amplify and multiply the fact that there were no factual evidence. There's no factual evidence for what President Trump was saying about the election results. And you continue to hammer on that. All right. But all of this, it comes around to speaking to the need for educational institutions to train students as part of all general education. And that's what this course was about. In critical thinking and healthy skepticism, right? Moral and ethical responsibility to support facts, truth, and expertise in public discourse, and the reasons why that is important to democracy and the responsibility of free speech, which most of us clearly talked about supporting, right? If we really support it, we can't just pretend that social media is not challenging it. It is challenging it. So if we really believe in free speech, right, we need to guard it. We need to protect it, right? The risks of misinformation, disinformation, free speech, and democracy generally is very, very significant. The skills and tools to battle misinformation and disinformation on social media become increasingly important. So, in addition to these types of media training considerations, right, democratic societies with protections for free speech must grapple with the question of whether regulation of social media is part of the answer. And as we go further in the course, we're going to explore some of those things, right, and have a little bit of fun with that, thinking about it going forward. All right? On that score, I'll let you go, and I will see you next time, gang. Keep going. We're in the second half of the course. Talk to you later. Bye-bye now.